Hi, Mrs. Lord. How are you today?
Thank you.
What do you think is the difference between narratives and storytelling in museums?
A narrative really is a recording, by whatever means, of the actual factual story from someone's perspective. It's a narrative. So a good example of a narrative is a slave narrative. You know, when the slavery period was over, anthropologists interviewed the former slaves and the slaves told a narrative. So a narrative is the factual recounting by an individual of a particular event or story. Whereas storytelling is something entirely different. Storytelling involves interpretation. Storytelling is what I would call the all joined up way of creating causality narrative. In other words, a narrative doesn't necessarily imply causality. It's a person's experience, right? But the story is when a third party joins up historical events and the narrative to give a sense of causality. Very, very different. And it's quite important to make the distinction.
What role do museums have as storytellers in this post-pandemic world?
Let's talk first about the role of museums as storytellers. Once you make assumptions about causality, you automatically are reinterpreting the factual basis of the narrative. And the history of museums is, of course, steeped in colonialism. That's where museums come from. They come out of the colonial era. And of course, the causalities that museums in the bad old days, if you want to say that, implied was a causality of superior people, inferior people, superior civilizations, inferior civilizations. And that was the big story of all the museums. So it's extremely important to introduce a third idea, which is what I call the meta-narrative. So increasingly, we need a museum to understand and establish what is the big overarching story that it tells that all the other stories fit into. And that is a deep philosophical question, the meta-narrative. Now, then there's the question of what is the post-pandemic meta-narrative? That's very, very interesting because the pandemic has made us all humble. That's really what it's done. Here's this teensy-weensy virus, and it really is controlling the entire world. Out of our humility, we should have a new respect for the narratives of the people, everybody who has suffered. But we have to remember, the world has had pandemics before, and we've had pandemic narratives before. And you know what? When the pandemic was over, we hid those stories. What will make us remember them today?
So, and a little bit about your soft power. Do you the role of your book? Can you like combine these two? Do you think
Okay, so the book was written in, I want to say 2015. It was written at a very optimistic time, very much pre-pandemic, at a time when globalization was thought to be a good thing, and now we have a whole critique of globalization, when cities were thought to be the answer to all the world's problems. So I think that we really needed, and I'm working on a new edition of the book, which deals with the post-pandemic world. So yes, museums have an extremely important role in soft power, which is really about de-weaponizing their contents, if you like. But we have to rewrite that history as a result of, I think, the new human sense of humility that this pandemic has given us.
If museums influence the way we perceive our environment, how can we be more inclusive?
Another very good question. So once you understand that there's a distinction between the story and the narrative, and you understand the whole role of interpretation and the kind of imputing causality, then you see that museums' best friends, if you like, are science, because we need the scientists to take us to the factually correct narrative. It's very, very important. Museum can't actually have the sociologists, and we have some anthropologists in museums, the doctors, the medical people, who can take us to the factual narrative. It's really, really important to do that. Once the museums collect the stories as well as the objects, after all, the objects are mute, then we can tell the story from multiple perspectives. And that is our key to inclusion, to understand the objects don't speak themselves. And there are many perspectives.
What is the message of a museum?
So the message of the museum is the meta-narrative. And that's a kind of a new idea that I'm pioneering with my colleagues at Lord Cultural Resources. It's, you know, museums have a mission, or they have a vision. They have to have a meta-narrative that they make clear. What is our overarching story? And I want to say the Tropen Museum has done a really great job of saying, you know, our meta-narrative, they didn't use the term, was colonialism. Now we have a new narrative for the post-colonial era. This is something they've been working on for 10 years. And it was my visit to the Tropen Museum in that moment of change that really started my thinking about that. So museums must make explicit what is their meta-narrative. And in many cases, they don't even want to recognize what it is. So if they don't recognize what it is, how can they change it?
How do you feel, think, or do about a museum? It's a personal question.
So I love museums. Museums are part of my life, but you know, they hold the record of human endeavor, the human search for meaning, about what occurred in history. But those objects are mute, and they only become alive when the stories attached to them are attached to them properly. So museums have such an important role helping us understand who we are, where we came from, and why. But they are not the repositories of all knowledge. They are the friends of knowledge. So the museum has to make the right friends with the people who are seekers after truth.
And we're done.
We do need 7.5 minutes.
And now we can just go and drink.